Hi, everyone. We are Red Licorice Reviews. I'm Val. I'm here with Alan, and today we are looking at Macbeth, history versus Shakespeare.
Yes. Um, a few comments, I guess, before we begin. I read several sources for this, both online and in a book. I don't claim to be a Shakespearean historian or particularly a history expert of the time period. So this is my best effort to make sense of what was kind of a tricky time in history. This is during the Dark Ages, so there's not a lot of reliable written records. So this is I say our as if I was part of doing the research, but this is the historian's best guess and what I can piece together from several sources of um, what happened with the true Macbeth, and then obviously where Shakespeare got his inspiration for the story, and um, and whether it matched history or not.
I can't wait.
Well, so let's dive in. Sorry, trying to see. There we go. For many reasons, as we'll talk about Shakespeare's Macbeth differs from historical Macbeth. Putting in this in Hollywood terms, as I was putting this together, I was thinking we would say that Shakespeare's play was inspired by true events, not so much based on true events. As we'll see, there's quite a lot of differences between how Shakespeare portrayed Macbeth and the historical Macbeth. Um, so Shakespeare's play was based in the kingdom of Alba, which is in current day Scotland. They didn't really call it Scotland at that time. You can see this area in red is roughly the boundaries of Alba at that time. Scotland was broken up uh, into a lot of different cultural groups, and some of them had come together to form this country or this kingdom. And then some of them were outside of this kingdom. So the Picts and the Britons were two cultural groups that were there in Scotland at the time. They were indigenous to the area. The Angles, hence the word England, they migrated north from England, so they were in the region as well. And they had the Vikings that were coming from Scandinavia. They were settling being a loose term, right? They were invading, conquering, and creating settlements in Ireland, Scotland, and England, as well as other areas too. Um, and then there were also the Scots, and these are the Celtics from Ireland, which is funny, right? Because Scotland being named after the Scots, and the Scots actually came from Ireland, which I found interesting. I actually hadn't known that till I
I
was
didn't know
putting
that
this
either.
together. So the Kingdom of Alba was formed in about 900. So just for context, Macbeth lived from about 1005 to like 1047, I think, if I remember my dates correctly. So the kingdom had been about 100, 150 years old when Macbeth was living there in the area. But it was formed in 900 when Picts and Scots united. Macbeth was a Scot, so he was of Irish descent. His group, or his cultural group, would have been some of the people who formed Alba. However, he lived in Moray, which is a little bit just north of Alba there. By the way, just I put the number in here because I know we were having the conversation when in the play, they make a big deal about 10,000 troops coming north from England with Malcolm. And I was kind of shocked. Like, that would be a huge army back in those days. Like, that would be a formidable force. And this, there's about 300,000, maybe 500,000 people living in the area at the time. So that would have been a very sizable group of soldiers coming north and would definitely have been scary. The it's worth mentioning that the borders were fairly nebulous at this time. It's nowadays we're used to looking at maps with, nice delineated boundaries that are done by treaties, and they're but back then they didn't really have that. They didn't have clean boundaries. You were really more a ruler of people more so than geography. And so it was really more about, the different villages and farming regions that were loyal to you and that were paying tribute to you as opposed to clear lines drawn on a map. It's also worth mentioning that Christianity had spread through the area starting around the 500s when the Pictish king, I don't know how to pronounce a lot of these names. I don't speak Gaelic, but Bride was converted. So by Macbeth's time, Alba was a Christian kingdom. So that's also worth keeping in mind as well. Um, Like I said, Macbeth was born in Moray, the territory north of Alba with strong cultural and blood ties to Alba. And Macbeth becomes king of Alba after Duncan's murder. So in the play, this is in the play, right? After Duncan's murder, Macbeth becomes king of Alba. So he's from Moray, but he becomes king of Alba. It's unclear how much Moray was part of Alba or separate from Alba. There's kind of some conflicting sources about whether, like, when eventually Macbeth becomes leader of Moray, was he king of Moray or was he this other title? Why is it escaping me at the moment?
Well, they say Thane a lot.
Yeah, Thane. And I think Thane is technically like a level below. I can't believe that this is just escaping me at the moment. It starts with an M as well. Um, Mormar. Mormaer. Again, I'm not totally sure how to pronounce it, but in terms of like you had king, you had Mormar, and you had Thanes. The Thanes would have been like below the Mormar. I kind of think about it almost like you've got president, like in the United States, you've got presidents, you've got governors, you've got um, mayors of towns. This would kind of be the hierarchy, I think, where you've got the king who's ruling over a large area and a large group of people. He sort of has his governors who are governing different parts of the territories, and then those governors had people below them, the thanes, who would then, carry out their orders and so forth. So, some people refer to Macbeth when he became leader of Moray as a Mormar. Other people name him king. Um, as we'll see when Duncan is king and he starts to go to war against people, there's no evidence that Macbeth joins him and sends his troops along. So you would think that if Moray was subservient to Alba, was like part of it, that he would have been obliged to join in those battles, but he didn't. So means there's some autonomy, but there's also, as we'll see, there's bloodlines that cross in these regions. So I think it's a little unclear. At the very least, they were kind of allied territories, but it's not totally clear to me how much maybe they, was more a part of Alba. Was it just an independent kingdom? It's not totally clear. And I've marked where the Vikings are on this because I think that's kind of important too to think about. They mostly in the Scottish area, at least, they settled in these outlying islands, especially at the time. You've got the Orkney Islands up at the top, and I don't remember what the ones off to the left are called off the top of my head, but the Hebrides, is that right? Does that sound right? I apologize to
I
anyone
don't
from Scotland.
know. I'm
Yeah.
so sorry.
Um, I think that's the Hebrides out there. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. I think it's also important to understand the lines of succession in Scotland at the time, because I think that some of this is what gets Macbeth really angry, both in historically speaking and in the play, to understand these lines of succession. But it also, I believe, partly like later people writing centuries, after this thing and how they're painting Macbeth, I think they also confuse and don't understand maybe what the succession was at the time. So it's important to understand that at the time he lived, the tradition had been that succession alternated between parallel lines rather than direct lines. And what I mean by that is, like, if a ruler died, the next eligible ruler was selected from like cousins or nephews, as opposed to sons or grandsons typically. So you didn't see these direct lines of successions that would jump back between families that were related, but that weren't in direct lines of succession. And then they would also typically choose the person they believed most capable of vigorously defending the kingdom, as opposed to just who was the oldest next in line. And again, it's really important to understand that that had been the tradition up to this point, but that's going to be changing right around this time, and that's part of what makes creates some tension and conflict here. Okay, I ended up making these family trees because there's some complicated family issues happening here. There's also a whole bunch of people named Malcolm. And so having these in some family trees, I think would help. And I want to look first at Macbeth's paternal line, and then we'll also look at his maternal line. Both are important. So again, I don't know how to pronounce these names correctly. I'm going to do my best. So we have this individual, Rodri, and he had two sons, at least two sons, but two sons that are important to our story. Findlay, and I'm missing an accent over the A, and Male Bright. I could not find the name of Male Bright's wife, but Finlay was married to Donata. Finlay and Donata are the parents of Macbeth. Finlay was the Mormar, again, Mormar king, not sure, of Moray at one point. And then Male Bright was his brother. And his brother had, again, at least two sons that are important to the story. Um, Gil Comgane and Malcolm, but not that Malcolm. So this is not the Malcolm that's in the Macbeth play. And then also important is that Gil Comgane and his wife Gruach, is that how you pronounce how I know I think you pronounced it differently the other day. Grock or
I don't know. And I'm sure like the spellings differ
yeah,
slightly too in different sources.
yeah. And they had a son, Lulach. And so these are kind of the important characters from Macbeth's paternal line. I'm just going to jump to his maternal line real quick. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right this second. But Donata, who is Macbeth's mother, she was the daughter of Malcolm II, who at this time was king of Alba. So he was king of Alba prior to the events in the play. During Macbeth's life, Malcolm II was king of Alba, at least at the beginning of his life. And his daughter was Donata, that was Macbeth's daughter. So then we come back over here again. So then Finlay is his father. Okay. So looking just at his paternal line, let's talk about some history about what was happening during Macbeth's life. So um, Male Bright, so Finlay's brother, was the ruler of Moray until about 985 to 995. Not quite sure when he died, but somewhere I've been there. When he died, Macbeth's father took over as ruler of Moray. So again, remember that succession jumps between parallel lines here. So Finlay becomes ruler.
So these are
Well,
brothers.
so these are
Went
brothers.
from
Yep.
one brother to
One
the other
brother, and it
brother.
went to the other brother. Yep. But again, rather than Male Bright's like sons taking over, like it jumped to another line. Not sure why I didn't go to a cousin again, but like it's not direct succession here. Well, in 1020, a power struggle ensued where Male Bright's sons killed their uncle, Finlay, Macbeth's father, to take power for themselves. So again, this is that jumping. So they kill Finlay. Rule is not going to go to his son. It's going to jump back over to their line. So by killing him, they were the ones that are then the natural successors to the rule of Moray. But again, so Malcolm, not that Malcolm, becomes ruler of Moray. Now I jumped back over here, not because he took over, but when his father was killed, Macbeth was about 15 years old. He was spirited away to live with his grandfather in Alba. Now, remember, his grandfather, through his mother's line, is the king of Alba. So historians suspect that he went basically to live with the king of Alba at this time.
Which that's so interesting because if he lived in Alba in some of those formative years,
Mhm.
that that seems like it would mean a lot.
Right? He would have learned from his grandfather, as I said, he would have learned how to rule. He would have seen firsthand, not just how to rule Moray, like I mean, his dad was more, but he was kind of young. But these are again, like you said, his formative years. He's coming of age in this time. He's seeing what it means to be king of a large region. He's also potentially, we don't really know, because again, there's not a ton of writings left over from this time, but he may have had developed a lot of relationships or close relationships with some of his cousins through Malcolm too. And we'll come back to this too. But Duncan, that Duncan from the play, and also Thorfinn, these are two of his cousins. Um, they were all close to the same age, and it's possible they would have kind of grown up in that, or at least known each other. They would have had maybe some personal relationship when they were a kid together. Um, and we'll come back to this line here, but I just wanted to jump over here to kind of remind us what's going on the other line and also understand why he would have gone to Alba and what his experiences there would have been. So we come back over here. So back in Moray, right? So Malcolm, not that Malcolm, dies in 1029. At this point, Macbeth's about 24 years old. So he had maybe spent about 9 years, 9 or 10 years or so in Alba. Now he's thinking, great, my cousin just died as the ruler of Moray. This is my chance. the rule should pass back to my family now because cousins, it would jump back to the other line. That did not happen. Malcolm's brother, Gil Comyene, however you pronounce that, became ruler. This is potentially very angersome to Macbeth. And also, I think this is really what's being portrayed in the play, because as we'll see later, the succession with Duncan and Malcolm, all that really didn't play out the way they showed it in the film exactly, or I'm sorry, in the play. Um, I think it's possible that that kind of event there was actually more modeled on what happened here, because Macbeth was expecting to be next in line, and it was, from his point of view, potentially taken from him and his other cousin. Now, we know that this probably made him mad because in 1032, someone, and I put this in asterisks here, we don't know who exactly did it. It was probably Macbeth or someone acting in his behalf, barricaded his cousin in a building with 50 of his men, probably his closest men, right? Probably his bodyguards and his war leaders and all that stuff, barricaded them in a building and burned them alive. This led the way to Macbeth becoming the ruler of Moray. And to add insult to injury, Macbeth married the widow of the man he potentially, maybe he, just burned alive in the building. He married Gruach and adopted Gruach's son, Lulach. And I also note here that Gruach was granddaughter of King Kenneth III. He had been a king in this region as well. So you've got now Macbeth with some potential claims to the throne of Alba here through both his grandfather as well as through Gruach, who he's married to now. So that was in 1033. It's like the next year he married her. We don't know much about her in the sense of like, you know, what her relationship was like to these men, how she felt about her former husband, how she felt about Macbeth. We don't have a lot of information about her, but um, yeah,
But she does have a name.
she does have a name. She's not just Lady Macbeth. Okay, so now let's talk about Malcolm II's succession. So now this is back on, he's the King of Alba. So this is would be through
Wait, is this that Malcolm?
this is not that Malcolm. This is this is a different Malcolm. This is Malcolm II. He's the one who's currently King of Alba. And he was kind of getting he was getting near the end of his life and he was thinking about his succession. And around this time, he needed to appoint a successor. Again, rulers were often chosen among viable candidates based on their abilities as war leaders, who they thought would have the necessary skills and strength to protect their people and expand and enrich the kingdom. You didn't tend to have a lot of direct line succession here, but I think there was maybe not a lot of good choices. His nephew, because that would have been a natural successor, around this time was actually murdered, potentially in a bid to create opportunities for other people. There's not a lot of information about who murdered him or why, but Malcolm II's nephew was murdered. That kind of left a vacuum in terms of the lines of succession, who was going to take over, because he would have been the natural successor. So the next three most obvious options were his grandsons through his three daughters. And I think I might have this on the, nope, I can jump back real quick to, so his three, so Malcolm III had three daughters, again, at least three daughters, but three daughters important to our story. So Bethek, she was the eldest. Donata, that was Macbeth's mom, and then Olith. Olith is interesting because some sources are pretty confident that she was a daughter of Malcolm II and therefore Thorfinn was a grandson of Malcolm II. Other sources leave them off the family tree. So I don't know if there's some uncertainty about this. One person even claimed that Thorfinn and Macbeth were the same person. I don't quite know how that could be possible. Again, so this is, from all the things I read, this is my best understanding of likely what was the case. But we've got these three cousins, Duncan, Macbeth, and Thorfinn. They're all grandsons of Malcolm II, all from female lines, from his daughters. And they were kind of the three most likely candidates at this point. So looking at the ages, I don't know if you see anything that's noteworthy about the ages here.
Look like you've got them ordered
So I do,
oldest to youngest,
I do,
probably.
but also Duncan and Macbeth. So in the play, how's it usually characterized? How's it described or
Duncan is often older, but like by a lot, it seems like.
right? It often looks I mean, from what we've seen, we just recently saw some movies and things with this. It's oftentimes Duncan's son is almost portrayed as similar in age to Macbeth, I think,
Hmm.
right? At least not that far off. But in reality, Macbeth and Duncan were almost the same age, and Thorfinn was not that much younger either. So they were all pretty similar in age. We don't really know what why Malcolm chose Duncan or how Duncan became the heir. It is believed that Malcolm II did choose Duncan specifically. It wasn't just like Malcolm II died and then everybody voted him in or something. It did seem like this was a line of succession. We don't really know why. This part here is me. I could imagine Thorfinn, if you I don't know, I'm not going to go all the way back, but Thorfinn's father was Norse. So a Norseman married one of Malcolm II's daughters. You might see why that he could be easily rejected, where you don't want to introduce Norse to that because in a lot of cases they were fighting against the Norse and the Norse were encroaching and trying to take territory. So that kind of made sense to me why Thorfinn might not have been chosen. But between Duncan and Macbeth, it's not clear why one or the other. But Duncan was the one who was chosen. And again, because of a lack of sort of other options, this is the first time a king of Alba in about 130 years at this point that Alba had been a kingdom. This was the first time a direct line of succession would have happened, where a direct descendant of the king would have been the next king. So things were changing a little bit here. So 1034, Malcolm II died, Duncan becomes king of Alba. Again, I don't know that this would have particularly angered Macbeth in the sense that this wasn't a case like in the Succession of Moray where he's like, hey, that should have gone to me. You shouldn't have given that to your brother. It should have been me, the cousin who took over. This was just like there were two grandsons. They both kind of had equal claim. One of them got it and one of them didn't. So I don't know at this point, other than just maybe like he's like, ah, that would have been nice. He could have been angry, but maybe not the same level of rage he probably felt from the other succession crisis. But Duncan becomes king, and he immediately feels it's necessary to prove himself in battle, as well as potentially subdue potential rivals. Um, and again, I think it's important to remember that at this time, kind of being able to provide safety for your people was of paramount importance, and also being able to enrich your kingdom and potentially expand it through war. So being a war leader was one of the biggest characteristics that made you a good king, and made you a powerful ruler. And so Duncan, probably having no real battles in the past to establish himself as this. I mean, didn't see a lot of evidence that he had warred or had led armies. So he feels the need to go out and prove himself as new king in battle. So the first thing he does is decides to wage war against his cousin, Thorfinn, who was up in Orkney. So he was, of the Norse. Let's see how this goes for him. So Alba versus Orkney, Duncan versus Thorfinn. Records indicate that Thorfinn soundly defeated Duncan 3 times. So Duncan tried to fight him 3 times. The first, he sent one of his, I don't know if they probably didn't call him generals back then, but whatever, his commander with a bunch of his forces, his name was Thurso, sent him north, and they fought in a land battle, and Thorfinn's forces won. So then Duncan decides to sail north himself with a fleet, and there's a sea battle and Duncan loses. In fact, there's a story that Thorfinn himself boarded Duncan's ship and Duncan jumped overboard rather than be captured or killed and had to swim to another boat and then flee south in this battle. Obviously embarrassed by these, he raises another army, tries again, and fails. So he's not off to the greatest start here in terms of proving that he's worthy of being king of Alba. And I think it's important to note that there's no evidence that Macbeth or any of his armies assisted in these battles. in the movie, I keep saying movie, in the play, um, the play starts with Macbeth out fighting for King Duncan. But there is no evidence that the sources that I read or that anything I could find that showed that Macbeth was actually out there fighting for Duncan. Um, so I think that's important to note. Well, so he didn't win in the north, so maybe things would go better in the south. So Duncan decides to amass an army. This was about, I think, like 5 years later. He amasses an army and goes south into Northumbria. This is right on the border between present-day Scotland and England. And again, he's soundly defeated. Again, no evidence Macbeth took part in this or sent any forces to help. But it does seem like around this time that people in Alba and in Moray were kind of starting to be like, look, this guy's not up to snuff. He's really not a powerful leader. He can't win these battles for us. We'd be better off with somebody else. So talk started to come around that maybe we need a better, stronger king. It's likely Macbeth was vocal about this, or Duncan suspected that Macbeth was behind a lot of this talk because, again, he was kind of equal claim to Duncan. Duncan already tried to take out Thorfinn, who was also somebody who had a claim to the throne. So it's possible that Duncan was just being like, well, people are talking about me and wanting to replace me. Maybe if I just go take out my rivals, there won't be anybody else and they'll keep me, or this can prove that I so it's not totally clear. Again, we don't have the greatest records here, but so Duncan, still in the same year, so he just basically had raised an army, and it's worth mentioning, when they raise these armies and they go fight, and if they lose a significant number of those people, it's not easy to quickly replace those soldiers. So it's not like Duncan took a lot of time here for time to pass, people to come of age, raise a new army. He pretty much gathered whatever forces he had left and sped north to invade Moray. Well, Macbeth, who allied at this time with his cousin Thorfinn, at least many sources suggest this. Some of them leave this part out, so it's not totally clear, but other sources suggest that he had allied with Thorfinn. Thorfinn's probably not still happy with Duncan, that he waged war against him earlier. So Thorfinn comes down with some forces. Macbeth is sitting there waiting for him. Duncan invades Moray, and Duncan loses again. So he's batting 0 for whatever at this point, right? He's
It
not
looks real
having much
bad.
success. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks real
Um,
bad.
and in this battle, Duncan is wounded. Again, did Macbeth wound him himself? Unclear. We don't know. But Duncan was wounded in battle and he fled the battlefield. Um, while fleeing in defeat, we believe he died in his travel. So he had wounds that were mortal. So at some point while he was traveling and trying to get out of the area and get to safety, he died. As soon as Macbeth heard that he died, he immediately sped to Scone, um, which is the ancestral sort of king crowning location in Scotland. The famous Stone of Scone or Stone of Scone was where it was thought to be like basically the kingmaker stone, and it granted them, um, you know, power and rights to be king and all that stuff. So they were crowned there. So he sped down there before anyone else could even really challenge him to the throne. So within like a week or two, as fast as he could get south and get there, he got there and he was crowned. Duncan's son was Malcolm, was about 9 years old at this point, uh, fled to England. This is
That
kind of
Malcolm.
common, right? Yeah, when one king dies, they kind of, for protection, they get the sons out of there. So he fled down to England. And again, so before anyone could sort of protest or offer a different candidate, he got down there and he got whatever religious leaders were in the area who crowned the kings. He convinced them to crown himself and he became king of Alba. We'll come back to this later, but centuries later, writers would use this as an opportunity to paint Macbeth as an illegitimate king because he kind of crowned himself without really letting anyone else who might have a claim to the throne even know Duncan was dead and come forth and try to make their claim for it. he sort of ran down there and crowned himself king of Alba. Now, did he really, I mean, did that really make him illegitimate? Did he take the throne in any way that was less legitimate than anyone before him? I don't know. I don't know if you can even make that case, right? He was clearly had just as much claim to the throne as
Duncan.
Duncan had,
Yeah.
and there were no really other good options at the time that Duncan took the throne, which was why they had that direct line of succession. So, I mean, I think it's debatable whether, you can really argue that he was illegitimate, but certainly he didn't let anyone have an opportunity to challenge him for it. And we'll come back to what people said about that later.
He also seems somewhat formidable, though. So,
Yeah. Yep.
and Duncan hadn't been.
Right. And again, what was most important to people, was the ability to protect the kingdom. And so I think the next thing is, yeah, what kind of king was Macbeth? So I don't really know about, relative prosperity under Duncan, but clearly he was not a war leader. He was not good at maintaining safety. What do we know about the kind of king Macbeth was? So the contemporary sources we do have, and even later sources admitted that his 17-year rule, note 17 years he was king. That's a little different than the play, which the play says it was like, I don't know, 10 weeks or so. A very,
Yeah,
very
it was a
short
lot
time he was
less.
king. So he was king for 17 years. They described it as prosperous. He's even noted as just as gifting large tracts of land to the church. So he was not, hoarding land and wealth himself, in that way at least. There were no real serious rebellions during his reign. There was a small one where Duncan's father tried to raise an army and come against Macbeth, but Macbeth put that down with relative ease. When conflict did arise, the people appeared to support Macbeth. They didn't rise up and support his enemies. In 1049 to 1050, so this is about 10 years into his reign, he made a pilgrimage to Rome and was gone for a year and a half to 2 years. This is not something that a king in Scotland would do if he was worried about interior rebellion, if he was worried about enemies on his borders. You would only do this if you felt like you were in a secure, safe, stable environment. During those travels, it's frequently reported that he distributed silver to the poor. So he had extra funds and he was willing to give this out to people who weren't even necessarily of his own country. Um, and sources describe Macbeth as waging a vigorous, successful campaign to stifle robbers and highwaymen in his kingdom. So he was doing a lot to try to protect the people within his kingdom from, robbers and highwaymen. So do we know exactly what kind of man he was? No, but a lot of these details do not paint the picture of a tyrant. Somebody who was ruling with an iron fist and keeping down rebellions through the sword and all of that kind of stuff. So it seems to suggest he was at least a
He maintained
competent ruler.
stability.
Yeah, he
Yeah,
maintained stability.
which it's hard to have prosperity if there's no stability.
And stability itself is a sign of a successful ruler.
Yeah,
So,
even if you did maybe lock somebody you were related to up in a building and burn them and their whole party
I
to
mean, he
death.
did kill his father, so I mean, it's
So, you
yeah.
know,
It's not,
complicated.
it's complicated. Yeah. I mean, you can be like, that wasn't a cool way to kill somebody, but at the same time, you murdered my father to take over the throne, you and your brother. So, you know,
Was
yeah.
17 years a comparatively long stretch? It seems like some of these guys weren't in power for very long.
I think it's a reasonable length. I mean, Duncan had only been king for I think 6 years. Clearly, he kind of dug his own grave, you know, with the way that he led. I mean, 17 years is a reasonable length of time. I think that Malcolm the second or Malcolm the third, who's Duncan's son, which we'll get to, when he becomes ruler, I believe he was ruler for longer than Macbeth was. Um, but 17 years, I think that's a pretty reasonable. And he would have been a lot longer had it not been for the invasion that's about to happen. So,
Okay.
what happened to Macbeth? How did he get deposed? So in
Was it
1050,
Macduff?
it was not Macduff. There's no Macduff yet.
Okay. Okay.
So in 1054, so this is 14 years into Macbeth's reign, Malcolm, who's now in his 20s, allied with Siward from Northumbria. Again, remember, that's kind of on the border of northern day Scotland and England, to invade Alba and defeat Macbeth. Now, they set off with between 5,000 and 10,000 men. So I was actually kind of surprised that this number that was in the play was relatively accurate, because I was surprised that of the number 10,000, but it looks like that might have been a good estimate. But most importantly, a large chunk of them were professional soldiers from England, and that's important. A lot of the times it was farmers and whatever that you were gathering for your army. Like, they had to go raise crops. You pulled in as many able-bodied men as you could without sacrificing food production in your country. And that was the army you formed. And then they all went home after you fought. So the fact that there were professional soldiers coming with this also made it a more formidable force. It's kind of unclear why Northumbria participated in this. Why would England give people in England, why would they give troops to Malcolm to go invade and conquer Alba? Like, it wasn't going to necessarily become part of England or anything. So what was the motivation here? Couple ideas though. Duncan was married to a Northumbrian princess. So there may have been some family ties here, which could have motivated this. And it's also possible that Malcolm may have made promises of fealty, tribute, or alliances with Northumbria because, again, Duncan, even though he was married to a Northumbrian princess, he invaded Northumbria. Remember, that was one of his attacks that he made. So Northumbria thinking like, well, if we could install a king there who's going to be our friend and owes us something, that would be worth a lot. So there could be some different reasons why they would participate. But Malcolm went north to kind of avenge his father. And they engaged at or near Dunsinane Hill. This is close to Scone. It's close to modern day Dunkeld and Burnham, hence of Burnham Wood.
Yeah.
So near the modern city of Dunkeld. So Macbeth was defeated, but it's important to note that he was not killed or captured, and his forces were not completely wiped out. So in the play, they show this battle as being when Macbeth dies. He does not die in this battle. He flees north into Moray, and Seward, who had heavy losses during this, he decides to lick his wounds and head back to Northumbria. So he does not stick around to help after this battle is won. He just heads back to Northumbria. This starts a period of contested rule. So what likely happened, this is what we think happened, is Malcolm crowns himself king of Alba, but Macbeth continues to rule in Moray and other parts of northern Alba. So there's kind of like two kings here, and it just sort of depends, who's in the area as to who's in charge. So during this 3 years, you had a lot of raiding. Both sides were raiding into each other's territories. There'd be little skirmishes, but no huge heavy battles. In 1057, so 3 years after this started, Macbeth is killed, likely returning from one of these raids. Lulach, his adopted son, succeeds him briefly, and I think it's literally only for like 11 days or something. It's a really, really short period of time before he gets murdered as well. And that kind of ends um, the resistance to Malcolm, and Malcolm becomes Malcolm III, King of Alba. It's important, for the context of Scotland to understand that Macbeth's often considered the last Highlander to ever sit on the throne of Scotland and the last true Celtic king, because many of the people who now are from the line of Duncan, from his line, are intermarried with Angles, they're intermarried with other groups to where they're not really necessarily considered truly of Celtic bloodlines and lineage. So a lot of people consider him the last Highland king and the last Celtic king to ever rule Scotland. It's also worth noting that James VI of Scotland, who later becomes James I of England, we'll talk about that again in a little bit here, was a descendant of Duncan.
That seems significant.
Yeah. All right. So we're about to get into now where Shakespeare gets his information from. Any comments or thoughts about the history of Macbeth or questions or
I mean, Shakespeare does what he does, right? Where he is definitely inspired by history without feeling constrained to get the history exactly as he might have read it in books at the time. Because we're reading about Cleopatra and Mark Antony right now as
right,
well, and so we see similar liberties there. Um, So it's very much a Hollywood version of history, it seems like, where he's up to the drama, which I don't know, people murdering their family members all the time.
yeah.
It's pretty dramatic by itself. But it's I did not know when you talked about the paternal side, and it almost sounds like the conflicts and the way they played out on the paternal side seem to be reflected in the play, even
Right,
though it's the maternal side with the names that we're pulling from.
right.
So a mixture.
Yeah. There's no scene that we know of where Duncan declares his son Malcolm as the person who's going to succeed him in the king, and that somehow is an affront to Macbeth because his son was like 9 years old at the time that all this was happening, and it was really about Duncan being a weak king and Macbeth and others maybe calling him out on that and him getting insecure and trying to attack Macbeth. I mean, he invaded Moray, he invaded and attacked Macbeth, and that's how he died. It was not any kind of murder in the bed or any of that kind of stuff. Again,
Although,
that's a little
yeah,
closer to locking people in a building and burning them alive
exactly.
than
So, yeah. So even though Duncan's death didn't happen like it does in the play, doesn't mean that historical Macbeth wasn't above
right. Killing
really
people.
vicious murder. Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
and we don't know anything about Lady Macbeth.
right. And I
There
don't
were no
mean to be
whispers.
flippant. Yeah, and I don't mean to be flippant, but like I mean, that's how things were done back then. You know, these people, these kings and these rulers, they were proving themselves and wanting to be strong rulers. And part of being strong was being willing to take out your rivals. And, I was trying to, again, not trying to be flippant and be like, murder is cool. And it's fine to lock people in a building and burn them. But, all of this was, I think, just part of their thinking and
It was
how
a violent
other
time.
things happen. Yeah.
So I'm curious, and this is just like in general, not really a question for you, but why make Lady Macbeth kind of the bad guy in all of this? Like there's no sources that kind of whisper that she gave him any of these ideas or
Well,
anything.
there are some sources that talk about that, but no
Oh,
contemporary sources. So there,
okay.
so we'll talk about that
All
here in
right.
a second and how the story gets shaped. Because as much as if this was the case, let's say that Shakespeare had access to all of this history exactly as I just told it to you, and then he wrote the play Macbeth, you'd be like, wow, he was very creative. He took a lot of liberties and things were really these was not all his ideas, that formed the play. So let's
Okay.
let's get into that. So where did Shakespeare's Macbeth come from? So again, remember Macbeth lived in the Dark Ages. We didn't have a lot of written records that were contemporaneous to his rule. So a lot of what we have were written by people that were writing centuries later. And they had some of their own motivations for how they painted Macbeth. Um, we don't have a lot of mentions about him. A lot of the contemporaneous stuff are more like praise poems or just mentions of King Macbeth. We don't have like a lot of direct mentions of him. Some records from the 1200s, which again, this would have been about 150 to 200 years after his death, will briefly mention him, noting Alba was prosperous under his rule. Note that he took the kingship without proper authority. Again, I think that could possibly be debatable, but not a lot of incredible details about his life or what happened. Around 1350, and I keep mentioning this is a 300 years after Macbeth's death.
It's a
John
long
of
time.
Fordon, yeah, John of Fordon wrote Chronicles of the Scottish Nation. when he told the story of Macbeth, he mentions a character named Macduff. So this is the first time we've ever seen his name in anything. Now, does that mean he didn't exist? No. Some of the records that they might have had at the time could have been lost between then and now. It's possible some of that, but we had never had any mention of Macduff until John of Forden's accounts of Macbeth. He described Macbeth as a usurper and a tyrant and challenged his legitimacy as a king. So he's not painting a very flattering picture of Macbeth. But let's think about some context for this. So this was in the decades after Bannockburn. And if anybody has ever seen the movie Braveheart, Bannockburn is the battle that's at the very end of the movie, right? When Robert the Bruce is there with his armies and he decides to fight against the English, he fights. Scotland wins their independence from England at the time. And so this was in the decades after this. So Scotland is kind of newly independent again, and they're trying to figure out what to do with that. So he's writing in these decades, and he really is concerned with emphasizing the legitimacy of Scottish kingship and lines of succession.
Because he's English.
John of Forden was not English; he was Scottish, but
Was he Scottish? Okay.
he wants to make sure that no Englishman can lay claim to the Scottish throne that's stronger than any claim that a Scotsman could have. So so they really want to trace bloodlines back to times of rule that were earlier than the anyone from England was ruling any of that stuff. Now, this becomes problematic when you look back at the way lines of succession used to go. Remember, they were not direct lines of succession. So that becomes tricky right around the time of Macbeth because you didn't have a lot of direct bloodline succession. So when they see Macbeth come in and interrupt a direct line of succession from king to king, this probably was not making their job any easier to try to make these long back claims as to who should be the king of Scotland and why it should be this person, not some person from England or whatever. So there's reason for him to paint Macbeth in a bad light and to kind of be mad at him that he maybe took the throne illegitimately. Around the same time, I think a little after, but again, a lot of this is nebulous. We don't know. They didn't have clear copyright dates on all of their stuff always. So Andrew of Winton, he was a Scottish poet. Right there should also make you think a little bit here, right? Maybe some liberties being taken with
Poet,
things.
not historian.
Not historian, but he wrote the original Chronicle of Scotland. So it's very similar to John Forden's work in terms of his kind of goals and trying to paint this line of succession. Not very nice to Macbeth. He was even more antagonistic towards Macbeth, however, and was the one who was responsible for beginning to add supernatural elements to the story. Again, not surprising. He's a poet, he's a storyteller. He's not, that's his character. So in his version, Macbeth murders Duncan rather than defeating him in battle. He calls Macbeth a literal son of the devil, and as such could not be killed by someone of natural birth. That should ring a little bit of a bell to people who
Hmm.
have seen the play. And he's the one who adds the weird sisters and their prophecy that Macbeth was invincible until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane Hill. So again, you've got a second source who's now painting him as a tyrant and a usurper, but also adding these other elements to the story, which are going to appear in Shakespeare's version. Again, putting a little context here, Winton's poetic treatment leans heavily on common elements of ancient folklore. So things like the importance of the number three, which again appears a lot in folklore, three weird sisters, etc. Women prophesizing about men's destinies, stories involving or set in the woods. These are all common elements of folklore stories. He's turning Macbeth's tale into a folklore story that would have felt familiar to people at the time who were reading other similar type stories. There were also many prominent witchcraft trials in Europe at the time, so discussing and leaning into these fears of supernatural influences is kind of a common theme in the day, and so he was tapping into that. Now, in the 1400s, and so this is 400 years after Macbeth's life, Walter Bauer wrote about Macbeth. He echoed many of these other feelings. So he's being cemented now as this tyrant and usurper in history. Um, left many of the supernatural elements out of his story. So he took things a little bit more seriously in the sense of he's like, I don't know about witches and um, you know prophecies and stuff like that, but I do think it's true that he's a usurper and a tyrant and all of that stuff. But cementing that legacy. Um, he also still did acknowledge that Macbeth's reign was prosperous. Still didn't talk very nicely about him though. So this is solidifying Macbeth's reputation now in history. Now, in the 1500s, this is getting closer to Shakespeare's time, much further away from Macbeth's time. Hector Boece wrote The History of the Scottish People. Was significant in that it's the first ever mention of Banquo. So Banquo is now added to the story like 500 years after the fact. Again, does that mean Banquo was never a real person? Not necessarily, but probably
But 500
500
years
years later.
after.
Yeah. And he's also the one who paints Lady Macbeth as a power-hungry queen, compelling Macbeth to murder Duncan in his sleep. Which again, he didn't murder Duncan in his sleep, and who knows the role of Lady Macbeth in any of this.
Well, she would have already been queen,
Right.
and she was queen before. So I don't know. Yeah, interesting.
Now we're getting real close to time, real close to Shakespeare's time. 1577, Ralph Holinshead wrote The Chronicles of England and Scotland. This is considered the first popular introduction of Macbeth to English audiences. So this is a book that would have been printed in England and read by people in England, um, but otherwise was not notably different from these other accounts. So they're still painting him as a tyrant and a usurper, but this would have been his introduction to a lot of English audiences. And for context, James VI was King of Scotland at this time, and he was Queen Elizabeth's cousin, as well as next in line for the throne of England. So people's interest in Scotland was kind of peaking at this point because there's relationships here. There's potentially the next king of England might have been from Scotland. So some of that. Banquo is described in this work as the direct ancestor of James VI. So if you remember in the play, Banquo is promised that his lineage would be kings.
Hmm.
James VI, King of Scotland, supposedly descended from Banquo. I don't know why they couldn't have just made him descended from Duncan, but I don't know. It works for this thing too because he was. Um, this is the book that historians believe Shakespeare actually had access to and read. Because he brought in some of those other elements, he might have heard the other stories too. He may have had access to those others, or they might have been common tales. There may have even have been other plays about Macbeth that were being put on at the time. His is not, we don't have a lot of those plays saved the way we did Shakespeare's. If everybody's familiar with the folio stories, it's kind of a miracle we have Shakespeare's plays saved. So it's even possible his was not the first play about Macbeth that was even written. There was a lot of stuff being written about Scotland and performed about Scotland at the time. So 1603, Queen Elizabeth dies. James becomes King of England in addition to King of Scotland and unites the two thrones. So this even piqued the interest more about Englishmen relative to Scotland. So again, this was making people just ravenous for content about Scotland because their new king was from Scotland. So Shakespeare most likely wrote Macbeth in 1605, so a couple years after James becomes King of England. They believe it was performed in 1606 for the very first time. You know that Shakespeare and his company were the king's men or the queen's men. They were kind of serving under the direct patronage of the crown. And so Shakespeare would have been who was always very sensitive to contemporary issues when he was writing, would have wanted the play to flatter the king. So he would have wanted to write a version of Macbeth that James would have liked. They even speculate that it's possible the first time this play was performed was when James's brother-in-law, the King of Denmark, visited in 1606. So all of this might have really been going into his mind as to how he was going to portray all of this to make James really like the play and to flatter him. So remember, Banquo was emphasized in these works as being the father of kings and specifically an ancestor to James. Also, right around this time was the famous gunpowder plot of 1605. That was fresh in everyone's minds, which would have um, really made people again considering like legitimacy of the line of successions and who really has the authority to rule. And then also there was again prominent witchcraft trials in Europe, which would have made the sensational nature of the weird sisters, um, very attractive to audiences and interesting to them as well. So to summarize, Shakespeare borrowed heavily from popular beliefs about Macbeth that were written in various chronicles. Obviously, he added his own embellishments. Some of the things just that are noteworthy: changes the relative ages of Macbeth, Malcolm, and Duncan. Used elements from other succession crises in Macbeth's life um, to justify Macbeth's actions within the play. That's what I believe, at least. I think that some of that is being mixed in from his other life. He also used characters that were introduced in various historical accounts. I put that in quotation marks. The characters like Banquo and Macduff, and he weaves these into his stories, even though, in the real stories, these characters either don't exist or don't seem to play any kind of prominent role. I think it's worth saying that it's unclear how much Shakespeare knew or really even cared about historical accuracy. Again, he had other goals, right? He wanted to flatter his patron. He was feeding to the masses what they would have wanted. This is probably the most familiar version of Macbeth to people who would have been coming to the playhouse because it would have matched that account that was in the book, but also would have had these, fantastical elements that were in some of the stories that would have pleased his audiences and would have echoed some of the concerns and some of the interest of supernatural things that were going on at the time. Um, and did Shakespeare even know the true story of Macbeth and choose to ignore it and go with this more popular account? If he did know, did he care? We don't really know,
But it was a success.
but it was a success to this day.
To this day, one of the most performed Shakespeare plays, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking that deep dive into the history of Macbeth.
yeah. More information than anybody watching ever wanted to know, but I hope that it gives people a little more context for the play. Again, this isn't one of those cases where I want to be somebody who's like, you know, taking some kind of popular movie now and nitpicking every historical element that the director and writer chose to change for the case of drama. I mean that's what Shakespeare did. That's what people are still doing today. And I don't want to come across as like a nitpicker, but I just think it's really fascinating to know the true story and to think about why the changes were made the way they were, why we get the story that we got today. Not that it takes anything away from the story. I think just knowing all of that makes it even more interesting and
I
provides
think
more
so.
topics for discussion.
I think so, especially as you pointed out, what he was trying to do and how he's trying to flatter King James and what's happening politically at that time and pop culture.
Yeah,
So it becomes a part of history in a new way too.
right.
Awesome. Well, let us know if you have any questions in the comments below. And we'll see you next time.
See you, everybody.